Our next speaker is Lindy Garner. She's the Regional Invasive Species Program Lead with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Mountain Prairie region in Denver. She's going to be talking about managing native invasive plant species.
Great. Thanks, Jeanne. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming and listening online. I'd also like to, of course, mention a thank you to my co-authors for the chapter, as well as all the individuals as designated by the logos on the bottom, for the folks that provided input and provided review for this chapter. One of the first things that I definitely need to discuss, this chapter is a very broad, conceptually oriented perspective on how the science framework can have management implications for invasive species management. This is definitely not prescriptive. That's, of course, not what we want, because as we all know, that you have to get out there on the ground, look at it from the site standpoint, and you have to be able to flex and change and evaluate all the trade-offs in these types of decisions. But today we'll be talking from a brief overview of some of the management implications that could support your invasive species management program. So as you've heard this morning with the science framework, all these other talks, it allows you to investigate the values and risks that you're interested in, and then look at a variety of data layers, that would be the science framework portion, and to identify those conservation and restoration opportunities that then you can help plan and prioritize where you put your operations on the ground. And so we're going to talk about that from an invasive species management standpoint at the biome, the regional, and the local level. So first, let's talk about what we mean in this chapter and this morning about invasive species. As we all know, this is, of course, one of the most significant stressors to the sagebrush biome. We all know that they're expanding and dominating vegetation communities, creating wildfire risk. They're a risk to infrastructure, gray and green, and reducing forage for livestock, degrading those wet mesic habitats as well, etc. The definition that we're going with is that as provided by the presidential executive orders. And there's two criteria that we have to deal with there. When we talk about invasive species and invasive species management, it has to be non-native, alien, or exotic, and it has to have been documented as creating environmental or human harm. The next thing I want to mention is whether or not they're regulated or unregulated. Regulated invasive species are just those non-native species that have been designated as on a state or federal noxious weed law. If it's unregulated, it hasn't been designated on a state or federal noxious weed law. The reason this is important, because this will have potentially impacts on your partnerships as well as your expectations when you're trying to develop common priorities, because some of your partners may be limited to only addressing regulated species. So for example, some of our invasive grasses are not regulated species, so some states may not be able to expend funds toward those projects. Or your expectations for our land managers out there that are having to deal with all of these regulated species, and then we go to them and say, well, why aren't you working on cheatgrass? That could be the reason behind that, and you need to have an understanding of those differences in the states and the different areas. Also, from the standpoint of native species, we know there's other things going on out there. We had a whole session this week on weeding native species. We've got the pinyon juniper issue, but we're not dealing with those in this chapter or this morning because they're native, and those are other things going on there. So the ones we are addressing are the normal ones we think about, of course, our medusa head and cheatgrass. But in this chapter, we're also calling for that recognition that there are a tremendous amount of other invasive species, often regulated, that our partners are trying to deal with out there and have been institutionally been working on these other species. So sometimes it's hard for them to change gears. You've got things that are also that are significant ecosystem disruptors as well, not in the same way we know as cheatgrass, but when you have yellow star thistle come in with a big, huge, hairy, old, large patch, we know what that looks like. It is not an easy thing to deal with. On top of, as someone has already mentioned, this constant pressure of new things coming in with the North African wiregrass, which is a Ventinata dubia. We've got bulbous bluegrass out there, red brome coming in. We've got tall whitetop, also known as perennial pepperweed or Lepidium latifolium, coming into our important wet mesic areas. Leafy spurges coming into those wet mesic areas, and then things like Russian knapweed as well. So we have a lot of species that we have to try to deal with out on the landscape, and the science framework is just another way that we can think about that and try to help prioritize which or how and what we're going to work on. When we think about invasive species, of course, we have these kind of normal critical steps that most of us do take. We have to know, we know this weed problem is extensive, so how do we parse this out? First, we have to think about where we're going to work. What are those priority management areas where we want to place those operations? What's the current state of invasion for those areas once we've selected them? And then, of course, which strategies are going to be feasible and fit with the variety levels of information that we can think about? What are the tools that are going to fit those site conditions and the level of invasion that's occurring there? And then, of course, what needs to be monitored relative to what are our management objectives for that area? And we'll talk about each of these. This is a little bit different way to think about the science framework in the standpoint of some risk modeling that I've been thinking about, trying to figure out where we need to place efforts. The science framework with our resistance and resilience concepts, you can see here on your right. Of course, we've been talking about that, how you can use that data layer to identify and help you identify priority areas for management from an invasive species standpoint. The one thing to point out that we talk about in the chapter, unfortunately, we really have this information only for downy brome. That does not mean the science framework can only apply to downy brome. We can use it for other species. We have some of this information being developed currently. Other folks are working on this. We've got other folks working on other modeling and environmental association relationships, but we do have to continue to do that because of that extensive list of other species. We also, oftentimes you hear about it talking about greater sage-grouse breeding habitat. You can also use the other data layers, things like mule deer wintering habitat. Work with your states for other areas that they feel are important that you want to pull out and put into this decision process. And then lastly, we also talk a lot about in this chapter about these other factors that affect which areas you pick to work in, and that could be based on things like these other things that affect risk, like disturbance factors, vectors and pathways. What are your road densities for particular areas? Those ecological site conditions that a lot of folks are working on, and then definitely the current distribution on that landscape for that invasion. That's a big seed propagule pressure there, and that can have impacts on whether or not you're going to be successful and what that return on your investment is going to look at. But if you basically take the three blue features in the middle, that would be your science framework process to then help you identify those priority areas for management. Okay, so let's think about this from all the three different scales. When we use the science framework and we use this resistance and resilience concepts, and right now we're going to use the downy brome layer because that's what we have. We need this for more species. I will say this more than once, for more invasive species. As you know, the blue and yellow are areas of high and moderate resistance and resilience, and so that means it's low risk to invasion, right? The red areas are low R&R, so it's very high risk to invasion. And so we've been talking about this from an invasive species management standpoint. When you think about this from the biome, you can start to think about, are there possibilities or ways we could use this from agency-wide priorities or statewide priorities to start identifying areas that are most at risk in some of those red areas where we might want to, you don't normally think about EDRR or early detection rapid response with cheatgrass, but there are pockets out there on the landscape at that regional and local scale. And so if we want to try to protect or keep that from getting started, or keep rush skeleton weed from getting started in areas, are there areas on this biome-wide map that we could draw some big circles and think about it from a budget allocation standpoint for invasive species management? Now, the fire community has been doing this for a while already and has really started to integrate this, but the weed community has not necessarily been doing that yet. They haven't had the skills or the capacity to build that in. We don't have our own really well-developed funding structure. So these are the kind of things where the science framework process might be able to help foster that conversation. If we step it down to regionally, I just took the example of Utah with cooperative weed management areas. These are partnership groups that work on the landscape on invasive species management, and a lot of times it's a combination of, just like some of our other work groups, like our fire work groups, with agency personnel and land managers. This might be an old map on the boundaries, anybody from Utah, but after what I saw this week. But Be that so it may. So then if we take some of this R&R information, so this is Utah, and this is where they combine the greater sage-grouse breeding habitat probabilities with it. So the dark blue is important to sage-grouse, and it's high resistance and resilience. So it's low risk to invasion. So you could see here, if the state of Utah had a funding pot, if they wanted to target particular areas to make sure that invasions didn't get started, or and they wanted to focus on sage-grouse, they could very quickly see what areas within the state that they could potentially place those funds, or they could put even limits on their funding allocation in that sense, or that you could go to target a particular cooperative weed management area to make sure you get them involved in your firework groups and have them be involved in some of those discussions for invasive species management. On the flip side, with the dark red areas would be high importance to sage-grouse, but low R&R, so very high risk. Just because it's high risk, again, we don't know the current distribution of the invasive species in that area, right? Possibly, depending on the amount of information that you have for that area. So again, then another institute or a university or someone that wants to target some inventory work for a particular invasive species or even cheatgrass, these are areas you might want to target to make sure that you have that current distribution, which will then help inform additional decision-making as you move through the process. So once you pick these priority management areas based on some of these other factors, then we also have to know the current state of invasion, right, so that we can start to step this down and develop some management strategies. There's lots of resources on this. I'm not going to get in this to a lot. There's been a lot of talks this week. We have information in the chapter and links. Whether or not you're using remote sensing, habitat suitability modeling, you're actually going out and doing novel data collection, there's a lot of ways where you can get status of invasion information. Some of these repositories like EdMaps or the BLM Landscape Portal have the existing data that have been put in it. Just some things to note, again, of course, these types of resources definitely depend on your objective and scale, right? Oftentimes, too, we don't have consistent information, again, for several species. Cheatgrass, we're starting to develop a lot of information at one scale, but maybe not at a different scale. That map in the middle with the topographic feature photo, oftentimes the information is spotty at best, and that's diffuse knapweed from the Oregon Weed Mapper. But some of our states have good databases just like that, the Oregon Weed Mapper, and then some of the cooperative weed management areas as well. So a lot of resources to try to identify that status of invasion once you start to step it down. As we determine the status of invasion, you are going to find areas that are not invaded, I promise. Everyone thinks we're not going to. The whole thing is not invaded. We do have some areas that are not invaded yet. So this is a reminder for folks that the long game is management for coexistence and maintaining those native plant communities. We want to try to keep those areas free of annual invasive grasses and other invasive species. This is Dave Pike's slide that he kindly let me use because I think it's just such a good reminder that this is the outcome that we want. And we have to remind sometimes our partners that it's not just about killing weeds. It's about restoring the rangelands, restoring a native healthy ecosystem. And there's a bit of a jump there. A lot of times it's hard to understand that jump, but it is, especially when we're dealing with the folks that are on the ground and they're overwhelmed and they're trying to focus on that one patch. And so this is where the framework can also help that conversation of just that longer game, that return on your investment, and how you can be successful. So we have to talk about we'll talk about the framework and how we can inform the management strategies and tools based on that status of invasion. So this chart is from Miller et al. With the Cheatgrass Management Handbook. Again, that's where the information is a lot of times. But again, it's not confined to Downy Brome because this chart basically follows the invasion curve that we've all learned in school. We know that as you have lower invasions, you can use the strategies of prevention and eradication. And as you go up that invasion curve, you start to get heavier invaded states. You have to start using more aggressive management to try to prevent it to going into another level of invasion to the point of it's going to either require restoration or you might have to flex to more of just a containment type strategy or even in some cases even abandonment. So in trying to think about this, I was trying to think about examples and trying to get my head wrapped around this and trying to think about how I would explain the framework to someone else. This is a chart, if you will, or a very simplified conceptual model that I just came up with to walk through a couple of examples. This by no means is meant to make you think that this is a straight line process or a linear process. This is an all over the board process of trade-offs and thinking about trade-offs. It's iterative. It can go many different ways depending on the site conditions. But basically, we're going to be talking about a couple of examples based on the R&R information, as well as those other important parameters to consider, like vectors and pathways, disturbance, those ecological site conditions. We're going to think about it from the invasion level. We're going to talk about how we use that information to determine our strategies, which tools to use, and then how it might affect that return on investment and whether or not you would be successful. So I just have a couple of examples. So if we take an EDR example first, if we have an area of high resistance and resilience, we might be able to have an objective strategy of eradication for those top 2 invaded states, where there's trace invasion and maybe a mild invasion with some perennials still. But if we compared that to a low resistance and resilience area, you probably would only be able to hopefully consider eradication as a management strategy for that trace area. Also, when we think about it from the tools, it might be possible that, or it might be an issue in the sense of in the low R&R that you would only want to use chemical to get in there and get out, and not use some of these other tools, which you might could use, like mechanical or cultural. In the high R&R, which is more resilient, can handle that additional kind of disturbance, well-meaning disturbance. Those are the kind of discussions you could think about and have with your partners if you're coming up with these management strategies and tools. In this one, the return on investment, because it's EDRR, it's probably going to be pretty high regardless. That's a very cost-effective strategy, but there still would be differences. So you can see from a high and moderate return on your investment or success, there still are differences. So if you were trying to determine which project to do, or you're trying to manage expectations with a partner, this will help you have that conversation of, okay, we can still try for eradication in this area, but the return on investment might be moderate to moderate low. We might not be successful. We might need more money. And it can help them start to get a better understanding and make sure everybody's on the same page. If we take another example, with moderate invasion with perennials missing, this is going to be a little bit more difficult, right? In a high R&R site, of course, restoration may still be possible. You could have an objective for restoration and suppression, the blue lines. You might have additional tools that you could use, and you might have a pretty decent return on your investment compared to like low R&R, where restoration might not be cost effective, and you can only really think about a strategy or objective for suppression and containment to try to just keep it from going into that highly invaded state. And you still may have a low return on your investment. So these are just some site-specific, of course, all that information comes into play to help you make those decisions, but that's just how the science framework, in my mind, can help folks identify these different strategies and whether or not they can be successful. From a monitoring standpoint, Leif talked about this. Of course, with monitoring, we always want to incorporate monitoring as well, but it definitely depends on your objective and the scale at which you're working, whether or not you are going to measure that response on the native communities, whether you're measuring a response on whether or not the threat has been reduced, and as well as whether or not it needs subsequent treatment. So overall, we know that the main principle is to promote rangeland health, and we need to keep that first and foremost in our mind. When we think about invasions, it is somewhat simple in the standpoint of you got two things you can do. You can prevent new ones, or you can reduce existing, right? We don't want to add to our existing management burden, so that would be the prevention side, and then you've got the reduce existing. But with invasions, the sober reality is that if we look at the current funding and capacity that we have in the invasive species management arena, I'm not talking about the fire or the range accounts, which that's great because agencies and folks can utilize those funds as well. At the current funding and capacity we have with folks like with our state partners and such, we're really only addressing about 10% of that annual spread rate. So we are quickly being outpaced by our efforts. So even more importantly, we need to think about the fact that we can really only be successful at the regional and local level, which can start to add up on trying to address those existing invasions. But we, more importantly, have to have that strategic place-based conservation with consistent effort, long-term consistent effort for invasive species, and we've got to do this through a partnership effort. We cannot do this alone, and there's a lot of great things happening on the ground. This is what's so exciting, being able to work in this arena now. On a more positive note, we could be potentially successful at the biome level from the standpoint or the idea of preventing new invasions and maintaining what we have, maintain those native communities, keep the clean areas clean, identify still, though, those areas most at risk that are still in that level, and gain that commitment for prevention, everything from best management practices, how we can integrate more of those BMPs into our fire community, the design of fuel breaks on the landscape, and then if and when they do arrive, to utilize the EDRR. In summary, the framework is an approach to identify those threats and evaluate the data layers to help identify conservation and restoration opportunities and prioritize where we can place them on the landscape so that we can have a greater chance of success and understand the level of investment that we're going to have and that we need. We've got to integrate more invasive species information into the framework, and we also need more information on the distribution of those species and the impacts of those species and those environmental associations so that we can get on those other species now also before it's too late.